Hey, welcome to Real Talk, where I give real answers to real questions from real worship leaders. If you are a real worship leader with a real question and you want a real answer, head right here and submit your question for a future episode. Got some good questions this week? Let's talk about it. I'm convinced, and I like your definition of worship. With that definition, it seems it should then be worship and praise, not praise and worship. Do I make sense? Thank you for your answer. So I have to read between the lines a little bit here, but let me just give you a little background here if you don't know what my definition of worship is. The definition of worship that I always use on this channel is that worship is a treasuring of God above all other things that overflows into external acts of glorification. So there's sort of two parts to it. There's the treasuring of God, I think I say in our hearts too. There's the treasuring of God in our hearts above all things. This is something that happens inwardly that overflows the outward action to external acts of glorification. And so to read in between the lines here, I think what this person is asking is, hey, I always hear of praise and worship. But the way you describe it, which I like the way that you describe it or define it, is that worship is first something that happens internally and comes out. Whereas if you're viewing praise and worship in terms of an order of operations, you have praise, which is the outward act, and then worship, which I think this person is seeing as the inward act. And so to read in between the lines, I think that they're saying, shouldn't those things, if we're going to talk about them, shouldn't they be flipped around? Because if worship is first something that happens inwardly and it overflows into praise as being one of the acts of glorification, then we should talk about worship and praise, not praise and worship. So I have to read in between the lines there, but I'm pretty sure that that's what this person is talking about, which I would agree to a certain extent. I actually think I would probably take it even a little bit further than this person takes it. I'm not just flipping the words around. I'm actually removing the word and putting the word is, and maybe I'm not even flipping the words around, because here's what I would call it. I would say that praise is worship. They aren't two separate things, and I kind of think about it in this way. Just like a square is a rectangle is not a square. Just like praise is worship, worship is not always praise. Because there's different forms of worship. In my mind, praise is one way that we worship God. So I think ultimately we have to talk about why this phrase praise and worship exists. And I think we'll find the answer to our question within the meaning of that phrase. So the phrase praise and worship cropped up with the contemporary worship movement in the 70s. I'm not sure exactly when that specific phrase was used, but in my mind, the term praise and worship comes out of the contemporary worship movement. And before that, I've read a lot of old worship books now. I've been reading a lot of books about worship and what people who lived before the contemporary worship movement said about worship, and I don't ever remember seeing the phrase praise and worship. They just called it praise, or they just called it worship, and worship didn't just mean the music. It meant everything that happened during a service, if we're talking specifically about what we do on Sunday mornings. And so whenever praise and worship cropped up in the worship-leading vocabulary, it wasn't just like this random collection of words that people decided to put together. There was a reason behind why they called it praise and worship, and it had to do with exactly what this person who asked the question is talking about. It had to do with the order of events in how we worship God. And in the 70s, there was that move towards a more contemporary form of worship, which when I say that, I'm not just speaking about the genre of worship. I think that that's something that a lot of people get wrong about contemporary worship, even though that is part of it. It is a genre of music, but it really, what I see looking back now is that it wasn't just a shift in the genre of music, it was a shift in the theology of what we do when we gather together to worship God on Sunday mornings. And part of that theology, not all of it, but part of that theology is this idea of praise and worship. It is the order which we worship God. And the order is this, that we start with praise, and as we move through, quote unquote, the outer courts, into the inner courts. We eventually get in to the Holy of Holies, so to speak, where we actually worship God. So the phrase praise and worship comes, in my mind, I think this is an accurate representation, it comes from the understanding that when we start our worship service, primarily the musical part, we have to start with praise, and we praise God, and as we enter the gates with praise and the courts with thanksgiving, then we slowly move further and further, deeper and deeper into a more intimate time of what people would call worship. And I put that in quotes because I think worship is more encompassing than that. I didn't mean it in a belittling way. And so when we look at the phrase praise and worship, what's wrapped up in that phrase is a theology of worship that says, hey, we need to praise God first and then slowly move deeper and deeper into a time of heartfelt worship. And what you get then is this process of worship that we see all over the contemporary church today. And I don't even think that it's inherently wrong. I just am not a fan of the way that it's described most of the times. But this is why we have fast songs at the beginning and then slow songs as we get towards the middle of the service where a pastor comes up and preaches. Because it comes from this idea that we've got to enter the courts with the gates with praise and the courts with thanksgiving. I'm trying to use the psalmic language. We enter the courts with praise and the gates with thanksgiving. I always get those backwards, whatever. You know what I mean. And as we have these high upbeat energy songs, we move further and further into the Holy of Holies where we can actually worship God. Now, some people, they aren't even consciously thinking about that when they talk about praise or worship. It's just they've adopted the language of certain people's theology, and they take that and use it as their own because that's kind of become the vernacular now as far as a genre of music. But some people act in that way, and I think there is some semblance to that where it's okay to see it that way. Like I said, it's just not how I would describe it. But there also is an unhealthy form of praise and worship. And I think that unhealthy form is best articulated in the Passion Translation of the Bible. Because the Passion Translation, first of all, is not a translation. It's just some guy who was like, oh, all of a sudden I got these secrets from God and now I understand the true way to translate the Bible. But it's not a translation. It's just somebody who's taken their theology and read it into the text. And that's what we see, for example, in Psalm 100. This is just emblematic of this theology taken to an unhealthy degree, I think. Listen to the Passion Translation. This is probably the only time I'll ever read the Passion Translation on this channel. Psalm 100, verse 2 maybe, or 3. I don't have the verses marked down here. Says, you can pass through his open gates with the password of praise. Come right into his presence with thanksgiving. So do you see the implication here? That word password is found nowhere in the original language, which is why you shouldn't be reading the Passion Translation, because it's not a translation. It's just it's a paraphrase at best, but a very bad paraphrase at that. But we've added the word password. Now, I want you to think about the word password. What does password mean to you? Because in my mind, password means I need a secret code to unlock something. I need a secret way that allows me entrance into whatever I'm trying to get entrance in. I mean, if that's our Instagram account or a Facebook account or our email, whatever it is, I need a password. Or you think of like some secret meeting where you walk up to the door and they like open the little viewing place on the door and they're like, password please, and you're like, praise, I don't know, and they open the door and let you in. And I think that this is the unhealthy extreme of this idea of praise and worship, because it turns praise into a password that allows us into the presence of God. And so what that means tangibly, practically, is that we do all these high upbeat songs and we think that we're attracting the presence of God to the room that we're in. And if we don't start with praise, then we can't actually worship God, which is like the slower, more intimate songs that we would sing. So it turns the idea of high energy, upbeat songs into a way to attract God's presence to the room that we're in. Now, I'm not saying that everybody who talks about praise and worship is talking about it that way, and I'm sure that a lot of people have a more nuanced approach to it than that, but I have seen it taken to that unhealthy extreme in the church today, and we can't view worship in that way. We can't view worship in a way where it's like we stir up enough praise or high energy in the room, and then that attracts the presence of God, and then we can actually worship God because God is actually among us. No, when we gather as God's people, he promises to be with his people in a special way, that there is a special presence when we gather as God's people, and it's not something that we need to stir up where we bring enough praise and then, like the tabernacle model, we eventually move through the gates, through the inner court, through the outer courts, through the inner courts, through the holy place, through the Holy of Holies. But God promises now that when we gather together as his people, he will be with us in a special way. There's a special presence of God when we gather together as his people. And so, to bring it back to praise and worship, should it be praise and worship, or should it be worship and praise? I think that it should be neither. I think that it should be praise is worship, but worship is not always praise. And I'll just give you one example from the Bible. I have like 5 examples, but this video is already kind of getting long, and I just want you to go through the process of going through like the Psalms at least, but you can look at other parts in the Bible too where it talks about praise and worship. Just do a search for the words praise and the words worship in Psalms or wherever you want to look in the Bible. There's several places, and a lot of times you'll see that the words praise and the word worship are used interchangeably. And it's like, as the people are praising, they are worshiping God. And to me, that doesn't seem that groundbreaking to me. I don't separate them into two things. Like I said, praise is a form of worship, but worship need not always be praise. And so I think the most clear example that I can find of this is in 2 Chronicles 29. I'll just read 5 verses here. This is after Hezekiah restored temple worship, and he brought all the people together, and here's what he did. He stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, harps, and lyres, according to the commandment of David and of Gad the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet, for the commandment was from the Lord through his prophets. The Levites stood with the instruments of David, and the priests with the trumpets. Then Hezekiah commanded that the burnt offering be offered on the altar. And when the burnt offering began, the song to the Lord began also, and the trumpets accompanied by the instruments of David, king of Israel. The whole assembly worshipped, and the singers sang, and the trumpeters sounded. All this continued until the burnt offering was finished. When the offering was finished, the king and all who were present with him bowed themselves and worshipped. And Hezekiah the king and the officials commanded the Levites to sing praise to the Lord with the words of David and Asaph the seer. And they sang praises with gladness, and they bowed down and worshipped. I tried to make it obvious as I read through that there is just this constant back and forth between praise and worship, and it's not like it's like separate things. They sang praises to God, and they bowed down and worshipped him. It's not like this order of operations. It was all in one act together. Their praise was worship. It wasn't like these two separate entities. They were commingled together. So I just encourage you to go to the Bible for yourself and look up the word praise, look up the word worship, and see, is there really a huge difference between those two, such that I need to form a whole theology of a corporate worship gathering around it, where we need to praise God first, and then that gains us access into a deeper place of worship. And just to, I guess, put my cards on the table, I do have sort of a form of that in what I've taught on this channel before about how I think our services should be ordered. I think that we start with adoration, which a lot of people would call praise, and then we move into a time of confession, and then we move into a time of assurance of pardon, and then we thank God that we have been pardoned from our sin because of the work of Christ. And then we understand that after we have been forgiven, we can bring our prayers and requests and petitions to Him, and then we receive the word as our pastor preaches, and so on and so forth. But it is not, for me, it is a remembrance of the gospel story. It is not effectual in how it happens. I don't think that you need to start with adoration in your service and then you, spiritually speaking, slowly move deeper and deeper into the Holy of Holies until you have fellowship with God. I believe that when we gather together, the way that I like to do it, and I'll call it what I think is the best and the healthiest way to form our people through the liturgy of our service, is to work through a remembrance of the gospel story or a reenactment of the gospel story. I would even call it that. But it is not efficacious in and of itself in that it gains us access to the presence of God. Our team is all volunteers. We have 2 people who constantly show up late. We have addressed this twice lately in team meetings. Any ideas for addressing this individually with them? Rules or guidelines? We have team norms that also address this. One was 20 minutes late this past week for Sunday rehearsal. I thought about just ending it on the last question, but I don't think that this question will take that long to answer. Here's what you need to do. First of all, recognize, and I always tell people this to sort of, temper their attitude towards their team members. You let it get to this place. So don't just throw all of this stuff at the people at once. Part of this happening is your fault if you're the leader of the team because you've allowed it to get to this place. So I say that, not that it's all your fault, that people need to show up on time, but just act with grace towards them and don't just say, you're off the team. Walk gently with them through the process. So here's the process. You already have guidelines. So point those guidelines out to them. Be firm in your expectations once you've pointed out to them that part of your expectations are that they would be there on time, but they aren't there on time. And if you're not there on time, then you can't join us on Sunday morning. You can't lead with us on Sunday mornings. So make that abundantly clear to them. And then the next time they show up late, tell them, we talked about this, and I'm sorry, you were 20 minutes late to rehearsal. I'm going to have you sit out this Sunday. And if you do that once, I guarantee that they will get the picture. It's not going to be comfortable. It's not going to be like a happy time for your team, but it will be necessary. So just do those things. Blame yourself first so that you act with grace, and then tell them the expectations, and then hold them to the expectations. Now, if you don't have guidelines for your worship team, I'll link my worship team toolkit down below where I have my code of conduct that you can look at and pretty much just copy and paste it right into your worship ministry. So check that out down below. Other than that, thanks so much for joining me. Until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.